July 22, 1945. North Pacific. Off the coast of southern Sakhalin. The math said he should be dead. By the end of the day, history said otherwise. At 23:30, the sea was black and flat. No moon, no horizon, just a low wind and the constant mechanical breathing of a submarine running on the surface. The USS Barb was less than 1,000 yards from enemy land, too close for comfort, too close for survival if detected. The boat slowed to a bare steerageway. Diesels idled, the sound carried. On the bridge, Eugene Fluckey raised binoculars toward a thin, dark shoreline. He wasn't looking for ships. He was watching a railroad. A steel line cut across the coastal plain, faint but visible where it crossed a shallow cut in the terrain. Every few hours a train passed along it. Freight, troops, supplies, all feeding Japanese forces still holding the island. This was Karafuto, the southern half of Sakhalin Island. Japanese soil. No American ground force had ever attacked it. Until tonight. The war was almost over. Everyone aboard Barb knew it, even if no one said it aloud. Germany was gone. Japan was being crushed from the air. Cities burned. Ports were smashed. But Japanese shipping hadn't stopped entirely, and the northern supply routes still mattered. Barb had already made history on this patrol. She had sunk more tonnage than any other American submarine cruise. Ships, escorts, harbor targets. She was low on torpedoes now, 6 remaining, not enough to waste. And here, hugging enemy land, torpedoes weren't the weapon Fluckey had in mind. He wanted the train. The decision hadn't come easily. Submarines didn't attack railroads, not like this. It meant surfacing near land. It meant exposing the boat. It meant sending men ashore onto enemy territory with no support and no margin for error. If anything went wrong, there would be no rescue. The shoreline was watched. Patrols moved along it irregularly. Japanese civilians lived nearby. Military police stations were scattered inland. A single shout, a single flare, and the entire coast would come alive. Fluckey lowered the binoculars. "We'll do it," he said quietly. No speech, no ceremony, just a decision. Below decks, the air was hot and heavy. Diesel fumes lingered. Sweat soaked into clothing that hadn't been properly dried in weeks. Men moved carefully, deliberately. Every sound mattered. A small demolition team was assembled. 8 men, volunteers only. They would take a 55-pound scuttling charge modified for land use. It was a crude device by design standards, timed, mechanical, unforgiving. No second chances, no remote detonation. You wound it, set the delay, and walked away. The plan was simple in theory. Go ashore by rubber boat. Reach the railroad. Place the charge between the rails. Withdraw. Wait. In practice, every step carried risk. Currents here were unpredictable. The surf could smash a boat silently without warning. The beach was narrow. A man could disappear into the trees and never be seen again, and the timing had to be exact. Too early and the charge might be discovered. Too late and the train would pass harmlessly into the night. The charge was set for a 30-minute delay. No one said what would happen if they were late. At 23:45, Barb turned parallel to the coast. The conning tower was silhouetted against the land for a few seconds, an unforgivable exposure if anyone was watching. No alarms, no gunfire. The rubber boat was lowered. Men climbed down hand over hand. Boots slipped on wet metal. One man nearly fell but caught himself, jaw clenched, silent. The sea slapped softly against the hull. They pushed off. The submarine backed away just enough to reduce her silhouette. Engines idled. Fluckey stayed on the bridge, eyes locked on the shore. The boat vanished into darkness. The shoreline smelled of wet earth and pine. The landing was rough but controlled. The men dragged the rubber boat into cover, working by touch. No flashlights, no whispers, only breathing and the faint sound of insects. The railroad was farther than expected. They moved inland in short bursts, stopping often, knees bent, heads down. The charge was heavy. Each man took turns carrying it. The ground was uneven, cut by shallow ditches and roots. Minutes slipped away. They reached the tracks at 00:07. Steel rails, cold to the touch, still. The charge was placed carefully, centered between the rails, aligned to maximize damage to the locomotive's forward wheels. The timer was wound. 30 minutes. The mechanism ticked faintly, audible only if you pressed your ear close. No one did. They turned back toward the shore. Halfway back, they heard it. A distant sound at first, low, rhythmic. A train. It was early. Too early. The men froze, then I moved faster. The problem was immediate and merciless. The charge had already been set. The timing couldn't be changed. If they reached the beach too late, they would still be within the blast radius. If they tried to retrieve the charge, they risked being caught in the open when the train arrived. There was no perfect choice. They ran. On the submarine, Fluckey heard it too. A faint vibration through the soles of his shoes, carried through earth and water alike. A train in motion. He checked his watch. The math didn't work. He leaned forward, eyes locked on the dark strip of land, waiting for something, anything to happen. Nothing did. Not yet. And somewhere between the trees and the surf line, 8 men were racing against a clock that could not be stopped. They could hear it clearly now. Steel wheels on steel rail, a steady, accelerating cadence. The sound cut through the trees and over the ground, louder with every second. The locomotive was moving faster than expected, likely running downhill toward the coast. The men ran bent forward, boots slipping in loose soil. No one spoke. Breathing was loud now, uncontrolled. The weight of the charge was gone, but the weight of time had replaced it. One man stumbled and went down hard. Hands grabbed him under the arms and hauled him upright without a word. His knee throbbed, but he didn't look at it. He couldn't afford to. The surf was still several hundred yards away. Behind them, the train's whistle sounded once, short, sharp. The sound meant nothing to the charge. It meant everything to the men. On the bridge of Barb, Eugene Fluckey raised his binoculars again. He could see the faint glow now, just a smear of light moving along the rail line inland. The locomotive's headlamp, dimmed but visible. He checked his watch again. 00:23. The men had been ashore longer than planned. Fluckey did the calculation in his head over and over. Distance, speed, timer delay, blast radius. If they were still near the tracks when it went off, there would be no survivors. If the explosion drew Japanese attention, and it would, the submarine would have minutes at most before coastal patrols reacted. Shore batteries here were limited, but machine guns and rifles were not. Barb was sitting on the surface, exposed. He had no way to signal the shore party. No radio, no flare, nothing that wouldn't give away the submarine's position. All he could do was wait. The beach came into view through the trees as a pale line where the surf broke. The rubber boat was still where they had left it, pulled into brush above the tide line. They reached it at a run. Hands grabbed for the boat. Someone shoved it forward. Another man pushed from behind. The first wave hit their knees, cold and heavy. They didn't slow. They shoved the boat into deeper water, climbed in clumsily, oars slapping against the sides. One oar caught on a root and snapped free. The man holding it cursed under his breath and pulled it back in. They paddled. Hard. Behind them, the sound of the train was no longer distant. It was almost on top of the charge. The explosion came at 00:25. It wasn't a single sound. It was a tearing noise, like the earth itself being ripped open. The shockwave hit the water a fraction of a second later, slamming into the boat from behind. The men were thrown forward. One went over the side and was dragged back in by his collar. Water poured into the boat. The air smelled of smoke and burned metal. They didn't look back. They didn't need to. From the bridge of Barb, Fluckey saw the flash. It lit the shoreline in white and orange, sharp enough to cast shadows. A column of debris rose above the trees, followed by a rolling cloud of dust and smoke. The sound reached the submarine moments later, deep, heavy, unmistakable. The train was gone. Fluckey exhaled once slowly. Then the second phase began. Onshore, chaos followed the blast. The locomotive had hit the charge at speed. The front wheels were torn away instantly. The engine lifted, twisted, and slammed back down across the tracks. The first car jackknifed into it. The cars behind piled forward, metal shrieking, brakes screaming. Steam vented violently from ruptured lines. Fuel ignited. Men inside the train were thrown from their feet, some crushed, some burned, some trapped in twisted steel. Japanese guards shouted orders into the night. Rifles were raised. Flares were fired upward, hissing as they climbed. The coast was no longer dark. The rubber boat bounced hard in the surf as the men paddled toward Barb. Their arms burned, shoulders screamed, water sloshed around their ankles. Then someone pointed. A shape loomed ahead, low, dark, barely visible. The submarine. Barb had moved closer, risking everything to shorten the distance. The boat bumped against the hull. Hands reached down. The men climbed, slipping, fingers numb, muscles shaking. One man missed a rung and fell back into the water before being hauled up again. They were exhausted, beyond it. The last man was barely over the side when Fluckey gave the order. Dive. The deck tilted, water rushed across it. The bridge hatch slammed shut. Barb slid under the surface as the shoreline erupted with light. Tracer fire stitched across the water where the submarine had been moments before. Bullets snapped and skipped, hitting nothing. Depth gauges spun. 50 feet. 80 feet. 120 feet. The hull creaked as pressure increased. Men held their breath instinctively, listening. Above them, the noise of the surface faded. No depth charges followed. No organized response yet, just confusion. Barb leveled off and went quiet. In the control room, the demolition team slumped against bulkheads or sat on the deck, too tired to stand. Faces were streaked with grime and salt. Hands shook uncontrollably. No one spoke. They didn't need to. They had done something no American force had ever done before. They had stepped onto Japanese soil, carried a weapon inland, and destroyed a military target from the ground. But the night wasn't over, and the enemy now knew exactly where the attack had come from. The pressure, instead of easing, was about to change shape. Barb ran silent. Electric motors only, no unnecessary movement. Men spoke in whispers or not at all. Every gauge was watched, every sound logged in the mind and measured for danger. They held 120 feet just below the layer where surface noise blurred. The hull was intact. No leaks, no immediate pursuit. That didn't mean safety. Japanese coastal defenses were uneven, but when alerted, they reacted fast. Patrol boats, fishing vessels pressed into service, shore lookouts with radios and signal lamps. Any of them could stumble onto Barb by accident. The captain waited. Minutes passed, then more. At 00:52, sonar reported faint screws to the east. Small, irregular, likely patrol craft searching the shoreline where the explosion had occurred. Fluckey adjusted course by degrees. Slow, careful. The submarine slid away from the coast, still shallow enough to risk grounding if he misjudged the seabed. Charts here were unreliable, soundings were sparse. Sakhalin's southern coast was known for sandbars and sudden rises. One mistake could pin them to the bottom. Below, the demolition team was beginning to feel the cost. Hands cramped, legs trembled. One man vomited quietly into a bucket, his stomach empty but refusing to settle. Another sat with his head against the bulkhead, eyes closed, lips moving as he replayed the run back to the beach again and again. The psychological pressure lingered longer than the physical. They had been exposed, helpless, timed against an explosion they couldn't stop. That kind of fear didn't vanish just because the boat had dived. It stayed. At 01:17, sonar contact strengthened. 2 vessels now, closer. Fluckey ordered a depth change. 160 feet. The hull groaned, light fixtures rattled, condensation dripped from overhead pipes. Men stiffened, waiting for the telltale sound of propellers stopping overhead, an escort pausing to listen. It didn't come. The patrol craft were moving too fast, searching visually, confused, no coordinated pattern yet. The explosion ashore had been too sudden, too unprecedented. No one expected a submarine to mine a railroad. At 02:03, the screws faded. Barb continued south, then west, slipping into deeper water. By 03:00, they were clear of the immediate danger zone. Only then did Fluckey allow himself to sit. He removed his cap and wiped sweat from his forehead. The adrenaline drained away, leaving fatigue in its place. He asked for a damage report. None. He asked for casualties. None. The math had been wrong. Dawn came slowly. Gray light filtered down through the periscope at 0440, revealing a calm sea and an empty horizon. Barb surfaced cautiously, diesels starting with a low rumble that vibrated through the hull. Fresh air rushed inside. Men stood a little straighter. The captain ordered the periscope trained back toward the coast. Smoke was still visible. A long, dark plume rose inland from the rail line. It drifted slowly east, carried by the morning wind. No trains moved. No repair crews were visible from this distance, but the damage was obvious even without magnification. The line was severed. The train was gone. The question now was whether to stay. Barb still had torpedoes, still had fuel, still had orders to disrupt Japanese shipping wherever possible. But the coast would now be alert, patrols would be thicker, surprise was gone. Fluckey weighed the options. Staying meant higher risk with diminishing returns. Leaving meant abandoning a coast that was still vulnerable but no longer blind. At 0610, he made the call. They would withdraw. This mission was complete. Barb turned south, away from Sakhalin, toward deeper water and open ocean. Behind them, Japanese forces were still trying to understand what had happened. The full extent of the damage became clear only later. The demolition charge had struck exactly where intended. The locomotive was destroyed. Multiple cars were derailed. The track bed was torn apart. The line was unusable without major repair. Japanese records later confirmed casualties among the train crew and passengers. Exact numbers were never firmly established, but the loss was enough to halt traffic in the sector. For Barb's crew, the aftermath was quieter. No celebration, no speeches. The men who had gone ashore slept for nearly 12 hours straight once the tension eased. When they woke, their muscles ached deeply, bruises surfaced, cuts stung where salt water had worked into them. One man's knee swelled badly. He limped for the rest of the patrol. None of them complained. Barb continued operations for several more days, but nothing matched the intensity of that night. On August 2, 1945, she headed back toward base. The war ended days later. When Barb returned, her patrol was already legendary. Tonnage sunk, targets destroyed, aggression unmatched. But among the crew, the railroad mission stood apart. It was different, more personal. They had felt the ground under their boots, had heard the train before they saw it, had run from an explosion they themselves had set. That stayed with a man. The attack on the Karafuto railroad remains unique. It was the only American ground combat action conducted on Japanese home territory during World War II. No invasion. No beachhead. 8 men, 1 charge, 30 minutes on land. It changed nothing about the outcome of the war. Japan would surrender on August 15, 1945, driven by forces far larger than a single submarine and a single train. But history is not only shaped by outcomes. It is shaped by moments that reveal what war had become by its final days, improvisational, relentless, and unforgiving of hesitation. For Eugene Fluckey, the mission confirmed something he already believed. That initiative, when paired with discipline, could still matter even at the very end. He would later receive the Medal of Honor for his command of Barb on that patrol. For the men who went ashore, there were no medals specific to that night, just memories, and the knowledge that they had survived something the math said they shouldn't have. The train never reached its destination. And for one brief night in July 1945, the war crossed a boundary it never crossed again.